Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Saoirse Healey. Tonight I'm joined in the studio by Professor John Robertson. John, how are you this evening?
Hi, I'm good. Hope you are too.
I'm very well, thank you. So, without further ado, we will dive straight into our first story. It was, as always, our Ukraine war update. It is day 469. Ukrainian officials have said that about 42,000 people are at risk from flooding on both sides of the Dnipro River after the destruction of the Novokatchovka Dam, with floodwaters expected to peak today. US National Security spokesperson John Kirby told reporters at the White House that the US cannot say conclusively who is responsible. He said that they were doing the best we can to assess, noting that destruction of civilian infrastructure is not allowed by the laws of war. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has condemned the attack on the Novokatchovka Dam as an environmental bomb of mass destruction, adding that only the liberation of the whole of Ukraine from the Russian invasion could guarantee against new terrorist attacks. In a readout from a ministerial meeting, Zelensky said the evacuation of people and the urgent provision of drinking water were top priorities. He also accused the occupying Russian forces in South Kherson on the left bank of the Dnipro of failing in their duties to evacuate residents and said Ukraine would appeal to international organizations to assist those people. Relief workers on the Ukraine controlled right bank of the river have reported having to work under fire. Andrew Negrick, who was coordinating relief efforts for US charity Global Empowerment Mission, said that the biggest difficulty right now is not the water, it's the Russians on the other side of the river who are shelling us now with artillery. The governor of Ukraine's Kherson region, Alexandra Produkin, said that 1,582 houses have been flooded on the right bank of the Dnipro River, and some 1,457 people have been evacuated overnight. TASS reports that Russian occupying forces in the Kherson region have set up 40 temporary accommodation centers in which there are 345 people. The rest of the evacuees stayed with relatives and friends. UN Aid Chief Martin Griffiths told the UN Security Council that the sheer magnitude of the catastrophe will only be fully realized in the coming days, warning that it will have a grave and far-reaching consequences for thousands of people on both sides in southern Ukraine. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov has accused Ukraine of deliberately sabotaging the dam. Zelensky's chief of staff, Andriy Yermak, said he does not understand how there could be any doubt about the Russian forces blowing up the dam. Russia has detained a resident in its Far East on suspicion of spying for Ukraine, according to the Russian Federal Security Service, the FSB. Two towns in Russia's western Kursk region lost electricity, and a man has been wounded after Ukraine dropped explosives on an electricity substation near the border overnight. There seems to be no immediate safety threat to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, 200 kilometers downstream of the dam, according to Ukrainian and UN experts. John, the attack on the dam, it's been condemned internationally as a terrorist attack. Is that a kind of denomination that you would agree with? Do you think that it is illegal under the laws of war?
Well, it's clearly a war crime, but war crimes are probably being committed on a regular basis here. There was I think after World War II, there was a kind of feeling that maybe warfare would become a bit more controlled in some way. But I think, as time has gone on, I mean, from the excesses committed by the US and in Vietnam, I mean, the Agent Orange tactics or Agent Orange strategy in Vietnam, some major war crime, massive damage to the environment. So that this is not new. It's not new. Clearly a war crime, but I doubt if it's the last we're going to see.
And what do you think can be done by the international community to help the people who are displaced within south of Ukraine?
Well, I think we can obviously allow people to come to our country. That would be the obvious thing we can do in the first place. But this current government in the UK are not too sympathetic towards that. They are on paper committed to helping Ukraine, so I'd imagine that they would allow a certain amount. But that's clearly not much of a solution to the problem. I, there isn't really anything you can do right now. Um, to some extent, in a war as complicated as this, there isn't a great deal you can do. It will come to an end, hopefully, sooner rather than later, hopefully. But I don't see any obvious solution. And the kind of solutions that some people might suggest are just too dangerous. I mean, for NATO to come in, I mean, NATO could get involved and maybe could close this whole thing down really quickly by completely removing Russian power in that area. It's clearly within NATO's capability with the weapons that NATO has to just end this. But the question is, what would come after that? How would the Russians react to that?
Yeah, it would be uh, a very delicate power balance that would need to be struck in that area for NATO to go in. So, next story of the night, the Scottish Government has released a statement on the deposit return scheme. Circular Economy Minister Lorna Slater today told the Parliament that the deposit return scheme will be delayed until at least October of 2025, in part due to the UK government's refusal to agree to a full exclusion from the Internal Market Act. Last week, the UK government imposed a number of conditions on the scheme, including the removal of glass and the requirement to align aspects of the scheme with others, like across the UK, which do not currently exist and have no regulation in place as of yet. Following consultations with key businesses, including producers, ministers have concluded that certainly some critical elements of the scheme cannot be provided to businesses until the UK government publishes more details. In her address to Parliament today, Circular Economy Minister Lorna Slater said that as of today, it is now clear that we have been left no other option than to delay the launch of the Scotland's DRS until October 2025 at the earliest, based on the UK government's current stated aspirations, adding, "This Parliament voted for a deposit return scheme. I am committed to a deposit return scheme. Scotland will have a deposit return scheme. It will just come later than need be. It will be more limited than it should be, more limited than Parliament voted for." John, what do you make of this would you say it was an attack on the devolution from the Tories? Do you think that, what's your opinions on it, first off?
Well, I think it's clearly not so much about the return of containers for drinks, just as their reaction to the gender recognition reforms wasn't really about them, because when you look back into the detail, you discover that by opposing them, they're contradicting their own opinions in earlier times, and they're also contradicting what they allow in relationships with other countries, or for example in Wales. So this is a power play, as I suggested before we came on air. This is a bunch of former public schoolboys who've read too much Richard Kipling, who want something like the Empire back if they only get it. And I think they would like to see, at the very least, they would like to see Holyrood trimmed back down to the level of that in Wales or in Northern Ireland, and maybe some kind of almost direct rule on a path, of course, to full reunification of their lovely empire. They would like the empire back.
And do you think that the kind of tussle against the DRS, do you think that would have happened under prime ministers like Theresa May or Liz Truss, or do you think that it is a kind of battle of the testosterone?
I think there's an element of that. They would no doubt deny it. And I'm not suggesting for a minute that I'm an admirer of Theresa May. I mean, she had some very xenophobic views on immigration. But I just have a feeling there's something very boyish about all of this. That it's kind of, it's toxic masculinity. These are boys who like to get together in the sixth form room somewhere and giggle about girls and talk about beating up, certain boys because of the way they don't like them. I think people will think I'm wandering off politics here, but I think underpinning this so-called serious politics, there is masculine immaturity on show here today.
Undoubtedly. And do you think that it's possible if the UK government continued to resist and resist? Do you see Hollywood pursuing judicial review to try and combat that at all?
I don't know. Because I think probably what the Scottish government will do is, to a large extent, accept it and hope that with every attempt by the UK government to limit what it can do, that the electorate and the voters will see what's happening. Now, at the moment, there's not a lot of sign of that. While support for the SNP and for independence have stabilised a bit after a dip, they're neither as strong at the moment, but things will change, I feel sure. Um, I don't think they can. I don't think they can win the media battle if they decide to fight back against all of these. I think they're probably better to go for the sympathy vote.
So, moving on to our next story, the latest OECD economic outlook for the UK has been released, and the UK is set to have one of the highest inflation rates of any G20 country, according to the latest figures from the OECD. The economic group's forecast shows that the UK is predicted to have an average inflation rate of almost 7% in 2023, higher than most other G20 countries, including Argentina and Turkey, and has also higher rates than nations like Ireland and Norway. In its economic outlook forecast, the OECD warned that higher interest rates are likely to slow economic growth and incomes in the months ahead, predicting the UK to have a growth of just 0.3% of GDP this year and only 1% in 2024. It also says that the UK's inflation rate should average 6.9% this year, higher than the OECD average. Commenting on the figures, SNP economy spokesperson Stuart Hosey MP said that it is households in Scotland who are paying the price for sky-high inflation and next to no economic growth. Energy bills are higher, mortgage bills are increasing, and shopping keeps getting more and more expensive. John, I think it's a pretty simple question, but have the UK been pursuing any economic policies that are trying to help the economy, or do you think that the economy is just in free fall?
I'm not sure if it's in free fall, but it certainly has dropped dramatically. It's the same old thing. We keep going back to it all the time. This mess is because of Brexit. There may be other factors poking around the edges of it, but this disaster is self-inflicted, it's self-harm, and it's a bunch of ideological nutcases, essentially. I probably shouldn't use that word. Ideological extremists, let's say. The European Reform Group and those politicians that are afraid of the European Reform Group that have dragged Britain and Scotland with it into this economic disaster. And there is only one way back. There is only one way back, and that's rejoining the EU. And I don't know how soon, but I'd be very surprised if we're not in some kind of membership of the EU in 10 years' time.
Interesting. And in your opinion, do you think that that's only going to happen as an independent nation, or do you think that there is an avenue back for the UK as a whole?
I think, well, obviously, if the people of Scotland have the courage, to back Scotland doing what every other self-respecting small country can do, then that will be a shortcut. I mean, we've seen the former Greek representative, I can't remember his name now, Professor something. We've seen he said it would take 10 seconds, 10 seconds for the EU to accept Scotland in. Scotland has everything going for it. It fits perfectly with European values and legislation. So I think that could be very quick. If we were to vote for independence, either overwhelmingly in the next election or in a referendum, if we can have one, then I think we're back in very quickly. But I think the UK, I think the rest of the UK would be in behind us a few years later, after biting the bullet and having the nerve to do it, and accepting that the majority of people in the rest of the UK are in favour of returning to the EU anyway.
Yeah, it would definitely be. I mean, I'd be happy. But so our
Yeah,
next story, home ownership is increasingly out of reach for many young people in the UK. New data has shown that the number of first-time buyers has fallen to the lowest levels in 8 years, leading the S&P to warn that home ownership is increasingly out of reach for far too many people. The data from UK Finance shows that excluding the COVID lockdown period in the spring of 2020, the number of first-time buyers is in the first quarter of 2023 is at its lowest level since 2015, and the number of homeowner movers is at its lowest since 2009. Figures also show that mortgage arrears are rising and people are increasingly taking out mortgages with longer terms. A record 1 in 5 first-time buyers are opting for mortgages of more than 35 years, significantly increasing the total debt paid. Separate data from Moneyfacts shows the typical rate for a new fixed-rate mortgage deal is now 5.75% for a 2-year deal and 5.44% for a 5-year deal. John, question for you. What policies do you think that can be implemented to try and encourage, obviously this is linked to inflation and the kind of economic state, but how can this home owning situation, how can it be improved?
well, maybe it's unfair for me to say this as a homeowner, although I should say a homeowner that took more than 40 years to pay off various mortgages to get here after various disasters along the way. So there's nothing strange about 35 years, I'd say, unless you're planning to retire very early, which no one can. I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding here in terms of how important it is for everybody to be owning their home. What we need as a priority is far more affordable housing owned by local authorities who will treat those who rent their accommodation with some respect and not throw them out the drop of a hat. We need a bit of a return to 1945 and what the Attlee government achieved miraculously against all the odds at the time when the Labour Party was the Labour Party, and built millions of houses, good quality, decent council houses. People pay rent for, and they should obviously pay the appropriate rent for, but where they're not scared of being chucked out. I mean, by all means, I'm not saying people shouldn't be able to buy their houses, but I don't think it's a priority for government to be enabling the slightly richer half of the population to get into their own houses and neglect at the same time the majority who really need their help to have affordable housing.
So would you like to see a switch in policy from Holyrood and a push towards building new houses and creating new homes for people?
Well, I think that even Holyrood has achieved much more than Westminster has in building affordable housing and in redirecting income from taxation or from other sources towards local authorities and encouraging them to build affordable housing. So doing far better than the rest of the UK, but still some way short of the need. So personally, I think it's a matter of priorities here. Um, if people are not able to get into accommodation, then I think the first priority is to make sure there's enough safe, secure, and decent quality rentable accommodation belonging to the state via local authority, not belonging to private speculators.
And how important do you think is the accompanying like tenants' rights laws that have recently been going through to accompany the increase in the council housing?
Well, I think a lot of these campaigns have been because so much of rented accommodation is privately owned, where for whatever reason, those who own renting accommodation that's being rented, they wish to make profits, and if they think they can get away with it, they'll try and make even bigger profits. And if they think they can, they'll throw people out at the drop of a hat to get somebody who'll pay even more rent. So there's no future, I think, for a social democracy that cares about its population than to massively increase council housing.
So our next story, there have been renewed calls for immigration powers to be devolved to the Scottish Parliament. In a House of Commons debate today, an SNP MP has called for the UK government to devolve immigration powers to the Scottish Parliament. Leading a Westminster Hall debate, Deirdre Brock MP argued that the UK government is failing to protect vulnerable, unaccompanied children seeking asylum in the UK. She also outlined how the illegal migration bill will make the situation worse for children who have been separated from their parents, and how it significantly encroaches on Scotland's devolved powers. Deirdre Brock has said that hundreds of children have gone missing from Home Office-run hotels, sparking condemnation from the UN that the UK government is failing in its obligations to prevent the trafficking of children. The illegal migration bill will make the situation even worse, as the door will be slammed in the faces when they arrive in the UK to seek sanctuary. Adding, I'm proud that Scotland has played its part in welcoming refugees who are desperate to rebuild their lives. However, powers still lie with the UK government and their hostile environment policies. Creating safe and legal routes is the only realistic way to disrupt the business model human traffickers use to exploit already vulnerable people. John, do you agree? Do you think that immigration and migration policy should be an additional devolved power?
I do, and I think it's perfectly feasible. I mean, it's a very small, narrow border between Scotland and England, and you can quite easily bring in legislation that makes sure that if someone is allowed into Scotland and they decide to move unilaterally to another part, that they'll be on record and they'll be unable to work. So I think it can be managed. It's not the case that it's impossible. Although I should say also with regard to children, there is already a guardian scheme in place in Scotland, so that where children arrive in Scotland, then they're cared for far more effectively. In England and Wales, they have to demonstrate that they've been trafficked before they're entitled to any kind of guardianship from an adult. Yeah, I mean, it seems like an obvious thing. Scotland needs a flow of young migrants. I think we could do with a few more from the EU who have been denied entry recently, and it would be good for the economy, I think.
Do you think that if Scotland had greater control over their migration policies, it could help with labour shortage issues that we've had in this country?
Yes, I mean, it would obviously help if the UK government had the sense to do the same thing there as they struggle with staffing in hospitals and care and in hospitality. Scotland is suffering perhaps even more shortages there. And clearly, if there was an ability to control the flow, that would, I think, unavoidably be a help.
Do you think that there would be issues if there was two separate policies for England and Scotland? Do you think that there could be issues along the border at all?
Well, no doubt that there would be something, but I think it's manageable. The kind of technologies we have today, it would be possible to monitor movement. And if people turned up in an area in which they haven't permission to settle, and looked for work, then they wouldn't be able to get work, and they wouldn't be able to get benefits or housing, and so on. So you'd be hard pushed to explain why someone would want to move when they know that.
Yeah. So, our next story of the night, British Airways, Boots, and the BBC have been hit by Russian hackers. The Russian-speaking cybercrime group CLOP has issued an ultimatum to Boots, British Airways, and the BBC after it conducted a cyber attack. The attack saw over 100,000 members of staff have their personal details stolen by the group, who have now issued an ultimatum to the companies demanding that they email the group by the 14th of June. Klopp's cyber attack exploited a software called Movelet. which is used by Zealous, a payroll provider. In total, 6 organizations have confirmed they were affected, as Aer Lingus and the University of Rochester have now announced that they were also hit. Many of these organizations did not use the Move It directly, but outsourced their payroll to services like Zealot, which was hit by the attack. The threat by hackers is an escalation of conventional ransomware attacks known as doxware. Rather than encrypting data and charging for a key, with doxware, the hackers steal the data directly and threaten to publish it unless a ransom is paid. The ultimatum does not contain an explicit sum for the businesses to pay, but it does demand that they engage the hackers in negotiations. John, so cybersecurity has been a huge topic of conversation when you look at geopolitics in the media. Do you think that the fact that businesses are getting hit, do you think that this could have knock-on threats to governments and to other international actors?
Well, again, it's not an area in which you'll not be surprised to hear no great expertise, but it strikes me as interesting that not everybody's getting hacked. Not every organisation is getting hacked. We hear that some are. So I'm guessing that the difference is that some are investing more in their security. Um, eh, Surely, yeah. Well, some are more obvious targets, but at the same time, I'm sure if it's possible to hack, then it's possible to prevent that hack. There are people with the knowledge in both directions, but I'm straying into areas, of course, in which I have no great competence. So I think I'll shut up now.
And I mean, just leading on from that, you were talking about some have been hit and some haven't. Do you think that these are just random attacks, or do you think that they were strategic and there's some kind of not plan behind it, but some reason why these specific companies were hit?
Well, again, I'm not an expert, but I would have thought that what criminals do is criminals look for open windows and open gates and so on. So I guess they're able to survey the protection software, the security software, and they find those that they can break into, and they break into those. And the ones which are better defended, then they don't. But that's me speaking in a very general sense in a way that it suggests I know something about this.
Well, we will move on to the next story. So, Mike Pence has joined the Republican presidential nomination race. Former Vice President to Donald Trump, Mike Pence, has launched his run for the Republican presidential nomination next year, placing him in opposition to the former president himself. Pence filed paperwork with the Federal Election Commission yesterday afternoon, and his official campaign video was released earlier today. In his video, Pence attacked the Democratic administration led by President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, warning about the radical left and looming recession, lamenting a weaker America, amongst other conservative right-wing talking points. A former congressman and governor of Indiana enters the primaries alongside Trump and the right-wing governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis. While Pence's presidential leadership run has long been expected, he has not made a significant showing in the polls, generally occupying the contested third-place spot with Nikki Haley, former South Carolina governor. So, John, what do you make of this? Do you think that Mike Pence stands a chance against his old boss at all?
It's initially a surprise when you see the kind of people that put themselves forward for high posts. And I think of Mike Pence as somebody of quite limited abilities. I know hardly anything about him, and I think that's a worrying sign that I don't know much about him. Is he a former general or something? I don't know. I don't think he's a real candidate. I think the worry is that DeSantis is a real candidate, and while I never thought I'd say this, 10, 15 years ago, Joe Biden is our only hope, and I think he'll win anyway.
And I mean, how do you think that the Republican primaries are going to go? You mentioned about DeSantis maybe being a real candidate, but do you think that he's enough to beat Trump's hardcore fan base? I think is probably the right word to call them, his supporters.
Yeah.
Or do you think it's going to be Biden Trump again?
Well, we should probably have Sir Professor John Curtis on here to answer this. I'm not a bean counter, but my impression is that Trump is not coming back, no matter how much fuss is made, and no matter how many protests there are, and damage to cars and so on. I don't think Trump is coming back. It looks as if DeSantis is the man, but I don't. I think the Republicans are divided now. They're hopelessly divided. I don't think they can come close. I think the Democrats walk it.
Do you think that what do you think is going to be the legacy of this first Biden presidency? Do you think that he's done enough to win over the kind of more moderate Republicans who wouldn't vote for someone like Ron DeSantis?
Yeah, I think that's true. His legacy will be something like phew. Yeah, phew. Could have been worse. Things could have been an awful lot worse. And at least the US has escaped what might have happened if Trump had come back. But it's not a huge. I mean, to be fair, I'm sure there have been achievements, but the main thing was to consolidate here and bring back some kind of semblance of a democracy to the most powerful country in the world.
And what's your opinions on, so when Biden was first elected, he, pretty explicitly said he was going to be a one-term president. What do you make of the fact that he is now running for a second term? Do you think that that's wise for the Democrats, or do you think that he maybe should have stepped aside and let someone else run?
Well, I can't think of a strong candidate who would be sure of beating. Again, there's an element of misogyny in all of this. There are no doubt some very talented female candidates in the Democratic Party, but they probably wouldn't be so confident of beating the Republicans. So they've gone for a man, an elderly, reliable grey man, who in an endearing manner occasionally falls over a sandbag to make us feel a certain empathy for him. I mean, that was clearly an assassination attempt, because with Joe Biden, a sandbag is quite enough. You don't need to shoot your president anymore.
Or send him up some aeroplane stairs. He's tripped over them a couple of
Yeah.
times.
I shouldn't laugh. My sense of balance is very poor. I can fall off a curb.
Well, you're the same as the President of the United States.
Thank you very much.
So moving on to our next story, the Scottish Government proposals to strengthen public confidence in policing has been unveiled, in the hopes of improving compliance and conduct procedures. The proposed new laws aim to strengthen public confidence in standards of police conduct. The Scottish Government's Police Ethics, Conduct and Scrutiny Scotland Bill has been introduced to Parliament with the aim of ensuring that allegations of misconduct are handled more transparently and effectively. The bill would revert officers guilty of gross misconduct from being re-employed in policing by placing them on a barred list, with an advisory list for officers facing an allegation of misconduct, and also ensuring officers can no longer resign to avoid being held to account for gross misconduct allegations. These new arrangements will be underpinned by placing the Code of Ethics setting out expectations of behaviours in a statute. To oversee these standards, the role of the Independent Police Investigations and Review Commissioner, the PIRC, will be significantly enhanced. The bill will also deliver the majority of the remaining legislative recommendations made by former Lord Advocate Dame Eilish Angelini in her independent review of policy. Cabinet Secretary for Justice and Home Affairs Angela Constance commented on the bill, saying that if things do go wrong, the police must be held account and improvements made. The principle of policing by consent, so central to our justice system, is built on this accountability, adding that if the bill is passed, it will strengthen public confidence and enhance the service already delivered by officers. John, obviously, this is a really positive first step in trying to rehabilitate the image of the police in the public eye. Do you think that it goes far enough in trying to achieve its aims?
Well, I don't know that is necessarily the case. I'm not sure about that. We'll see. I think it's a very strong first step. I think it's coincidental that it follows from the comments by the retiring chief of police that Police Scotland were institutionally racist and misogynistic and exploitative and so on. There is a political background to all of this. While I don't deny for a minute that Police Scotland, like every other police force, has work to do on certain issues such as those I've touched on there. I think it's very important to recognise that this is also a political is a response to a political campaign to weaken the Scottish Government by suggesting that Police Scotland are somehow just as bad as the Met. And that's patently not true. Police Scotland have made steps over the last 10, 15 years. Considerable progress has been made by Police Scotland. And while, as I said, they can still get better, they're nowhere near as dysfunctional as the Met or some of the major police systems south of the border. They've covered a lot of ground. They've been complimented on their human rights approach. If you remember the policing of COP26 and compare that with the performance of police south of the border in protests, including the vigil for the girl murdered by a police officer, the disgraceful behaviour of the Met there, and contrast that with the very light touch of Police Scotland at the COP26 conference, where they were complimented the behaviour. The Save Everard case. Yeah, I think it's important to keep that in mind. And there is one issue, of course, where I wonder. I've several times in my blog I've reported statistics to show that Police Scotland is making progress and reports on various initiatives they've taken. But the raid on the Murrell household with, I don't know, 14 vans and about, I can't remember how many dozen police officers there, was a bit unfortunate, though I tend to think Police Scotland were told what to do there. I think it's important to keep in mind that this is worthy, and I don't deny for a minute that there improvements need to be made, but it is not the case. It's not the case that Police Scotland have the problems that the Met has. Nowhere near it.
And why is it that why do you think that the light has very much been on Police Scotland rather than attention on the Met to try and push for these kinds of reforms?
Well, I see that. I think there is a constant tendency, in particular in BBC Scotland, that wherever something very negative appears south of the border, they will try to include us, try to remind us that, something terrible is happening in England, but don't think you're different. And while, I never for a moment would suggest that we are in a revolutionary sense different from England and Wales. We have many of the same problems. But after 15 years of government by a party based in the country, with an interest in the country, and after positive developments such as the centralising of the police, centralising of the Police Scotland was a very good thing to do, and there are lots of bits and pieces of statistics to show that it has worked very well. There are weaknesses here and there, sure, but this is a political move via the media, at least part of it. I mean, obviously there's some substance too, to weaken the Scottish Government.
And would you just be able to talk a little bit more about the kind of very visible differences between before the centralisation and after the centralisation, just so that we can see that kind of visible progress?
Was the standardisation? That
Standardisation.
someone was treated pretty much the same way in all parts of Scotland, and in the past there were major differences between the performance of the police in different parts of the country. There's still a huge amount to be done. I mean, obviously, areas such as rape and sex offences, enormous ground to be covered here. I'm not suggesting there isn't. But Police Scotland, Police Scotland have, in this last 10, 15 years, have been operating in a system, in a situation where crime has fallen dramatically. And while I would never suggest for a minute that crime falling dramatically is just because of police initiatives, but it must be partly because of those initiatives. And, if crime had soared in Scotland after the merger of the different police forces, if crime had soared, they'd be blamed for it. But it has gone the other way. And while there's lots of other factors, and I think the Scottish Government's economic policies will have played a part in helping to reduce crime. It's multifactorial. But there is this major piece of evidence that Scotland is, in terms of crime, a far better place to live than it was only 15, 20 years ago. Crime is half. We have the lowest homicide rate in the UK. Imagine that. I mean, 15, 20 years ago, telling a Scot that we would have the lowest homicide rate in the UK. Murder city, no mean city, and so on. Scotland is transformed, and the police have to take some credit for that.
That's really interesting. Thank you. So, our next story of the night. An independent review of the skills in Scotland has been published. According to an independent review, major structural reforms to the current way skills are delivered in Scotland is needed. James Withers' independent review of the skills delivery landscape outlines recommendations to ensure that the public sector can meet the level of economic transformation expected in the years ahead. The Scottish Government initiated the Withers Review in August 2022, seeking recommendations on how the public body landscape should be adapted to drive forward ministers' ambitions for a skilled workforce, as set out in the National Strategy for Economic Transformation, the NSET. Withers' recommendations included giving the enterprise agencies a clear remit for supporting businesses with workforce planning as an embedded and integrated part of business development and planning. Ensuring that there is a clear remit for the new qualifications body, the successor of the SQA, in overseeing development and accreditation of all publicly funded post-school qualifications. Moving responsibility for national skills planning to the Scottish Government, and reform of the SDS to create a new body with a singular focus on careers, advice and education. Commenting on the review, Minister for Further and Higher Education Graham Day said that this review is comprehensive and the direction of travel it points us towards is very helpful. Adding, I'm extremely grateful to James Withers for the broad and extensive range of work he has carried out to assist us in developing a skills offering fit for the years ahead. John, this ties in quite well to what we were talking about earlier with the labour shortage and migration policies. Do you think that there is this kind of necessary push towards a skilled workforce?
Well, yes, of course. I mean, the world is changing fast around children as they leave school, and education tends to lag a bit behind the wider social and economic changes. So any attempt to kind of catch up a bit, and while I haven't read the full detail of this initiative, it's very important not to stand still, because you're in danger of having an education system which is designed for the previous century or the previous decades. So I'm a little suspicious sometimes when people talk about a skills based approach. We've had this in the past. This is not the first time that governments, UK governments, have looked at statistics, comparing us with, say, Germany or whatever, and have decided that our education is too general, too theoretical, too curriculum based, and not sufficiently skill based. So I think important we do this, but not to get too carried away with it. A certain amount of the actual development has to take place, I think, within the employers in terms of developing skills that actually fit what they're looking for, because you can't really always develop generic skills. The context can often vary quite dramatically between one employer and another. So I think we have to still expect a lot of employers to make sure they allocate resources for that kind of development.
And what's your opinions on um, I don't know if you remember in 2020, the Conservative government pushed for a reskilling of people within the creative arts. So there's always kind of been this battle between pursuing creativity versus these kind of more traditional skills. What's your opinion on that, and what kind of policy avenue do you think's like most appropriate to ensure that there is that balance? Because, you know, society flourishes when you have creatives creating.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bit of a kind of problem, I think, with the idea of developing creativity, and I think it's going to be very careful that. I mean, this is not an area again, not an area of expertise, but I'd be wary of investing too much in programs that are somehow expecting to develop creativity in a kind of directional way. I think what we have to do is fund institutions and fund professionals who work in them, and fund, of course, people who are already creatives in different organisations, and to some extent hold back a bit from telling them what to do. You need to be a bit more trusting. Um, you know, you can't force feed creativity into people. I think you have to give them a context in which they can feel secure enough to try things out.
So, our final story of the night, Carrying a Stream, a new exhibition with a carrying stream, is a new exhibition with archive voices, creates a sense of Scotland's past. A haunting sound and video installations inspired by archive records spanning 70 years are offering exhibition audiences a fresh perspective on Scotland's rich oral traditions. New commissions, which feature recordings from a remarkable University of Edinburgh resource, take gallery goers on a sensory journey around the cities, towns, countrysides, and coasts of Scotland. Each of the three artists involved, Blair Coron, Fraser McBath, and Carla Sayer, has responded to the chosen theme based on previous engagement with the archives. The exhibition's title comes from a line by poet, songwriter, and political activist Hamish Henderson, who was a researcher in the school. Exhibition co-curator Bianca Packham explained that traditions ebb and flow. They wind their way through time and space, shaped by the people and places they encounter, deeply rooted yet constantly evolving. Hamish Henderson's Carrying Stream encapsulates this fluidity and dynamism, reminding us that traditions are always in a state of flux. Blair Coron is a multi-instrumentalist and songwriter from Fife. Fraser McBeath is an audiovisual artist and from the Isle of Lewis. And Carla Sayer is an Edinburgh-based music creator and Edinburgh College of Art graduate whose work is a journey into Scotland's industrial past. The School of Scottish Studies at the University of Edinburgh was established in 1951 to collect, preserve, research, and publish material relating to the cultural traditions and folklore of Scotland. Staff and student field workers at the school have made around 33,000 recordings that include songs, instrumental music, tales, customs, beliefs, and local history. The early collectors visited crofting, farming, and fishing communities to gather information on a range of cultural topics, with many aspects of urban life documented too. Archive material comes from across Scotland and its diaspora, as well as being a rich repository of oral tradition. It is invaluable for its range of dialects and accents in Gaelic, Scots, and English. A carrying stream will run from the 9th of June to the 30th of September in the University of Edinburgh's main library at 30 George Square. Admission is free. John, this rich cultural collection, is this something that you'll be going to see?
Well, I'm not likely to go and see it, given that I'm quite lazy with these things. But I'd rather find out things in my own study and on my own screen. But I'm a big fan of Hamish Henderson historically, so I'd be interested in this particular project. And I think it's an area that needs to be dealt with, because I can't imagine many young people know who Hamish Henderson was. I've never met anyone in recent times, and I've often occasionally, well, not often, but sometimes I've told some of his jokes. He had a man of tremendous humour. So, I mean, I welcome the initiative and I hope it goes well, but I have to admit I'm too lazy to go all the way through.
Do you want to share with us one of his jokes at all, or anything in particular about Hamish Henderson?
Well, the only one that comes to mind is the one I told you earlier, where he talked. He himself served in World War II in the campaign in Italy. He was an intelligence officer, and I think, and quite interestingly, he was an intelligence officer because he'd been a member of the card carrying member of the Communist Party before the war. So they obviously were. Well, I didn't know about the Quakers. Somebody's speaking in the background here, and nobody can see them. But I didn't know anything about the Quakers. But he was a member of the Communist Party, as I understand it. And he, in particular, obviously, he was an historian and songwriter, and an authority on a whole range of aspects of culture, including language. But as I understand it, he told the story of the ubiquitous Scottish soldier. This was the idea, partly based on truth, that there were very large numbers of young Scotsmen during times of poverty here fighting in various mercenary armies across Europe. And the story centred around one called James Keith, General James Keith, who was at this particular point in the story fighting for the Russians in the Balkans. So the Balkan Wars were ongoing then too. And he was fighting for the Russians against the Turks. And the weather was becoming a bit kind of wet, and the tracks were too muddy to continue the war. So they signed a peace deal over the winter. And so Sir James Keith, wearing full Russian gear, is sitting at one of the end of the table, and there's a Turkish general at the other end. And after they've signed, the Turkish general gets up, comes round, and claps his hand on Jimmy Keith's shoulder and says, "Well, Jimmy, who are things in Inverurie?" And that was an exaggeration of the idea, but it's based on truth, that there were Scots fighting. Not something to be proud of, actually, I wouldn't have thought, but it's something much talked about.
Yeah. Well, that's it for this evening. Thank you so much, John, for joining us. Thanks for all of your insights. I hope you enjoyed yourself on the show tonight.
I did, thank you.
So before I go, I just want to remind everyone watching at home that Broadcasting Scotland here, we depend on the generosity of you, our supporters, our viewers. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make regular monthly payments, thank you so much. Our programs will, of course, always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We've set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers, which will enable us to employ staff and make even more programs for you at home to enjoy. I've been Saoirse Healey. Good night, and thank you for watching.